How do you tell a class to come to order in an American school?
Somebody back there that says.
Yeah?
Oh, do you have the signals?
You're not allowed to throw chalk any longer, I suppose.
Sure you are.
You are? Yeah. Right. If things get really serious, I've got ammunition. Okay. Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Alhamdulillah. Wassalatu wassalamu ala rasulillah wa alihi wa sahbihi wa man wala. And no, I'm not going to give this entire lecture in Arabic, just in case you were starting to look anxious. This is going to be one of those introductory lectures, and in a sense the most difficult kind of lectures to give, particularly for those of us who are career academics. And one of the many strange things that happen to us is that we get less and less good at talking about... Yes? You can't hear? Right. The acoustics here are slightly peculiar. If you can't hear me, please do gesticulate and I'll turn the volume up. Is that a bit better? Yes. You can? Okay. Yeah, I was saying that if you're an academic, you get less and less good at talking about basic, important, fundamental things, and better and better at talking about obscurities. So if I mention this because if I take too much for granted, there are funny words I use that you're not familiar with, or I haven't defined them sufficiently well, please do feel free to interrupt or wave your arms in an angry fashion, and I'll try and fill you in. What I'm going to do in this first lecture is to get out of the way some disparate, but I think more or less indispensable preliminary matters. There are four of these that I'm going to be speaking of today. Firstly, what's known fashionably as the cognitive problem. What this means, quite simply, is what actually is going on when we try to grasp the meaning and the reality of somebody else's religion or try and convey it to others. Secondly, I'll speak briefly about why Islam should be worth studying. Is it actually worth our while taking 2 weeks out of our busy schedule to sit here in northern New Mexico and study this thing that, in most curriculums at any rate, is pretty marginal? Thirdly, I'll be attempting a brief overview of the so-called 5 pillars of Islam. And fourthly and finally, I'll be talking about some of the other outward manifestations of the Islamic religion, including a very brief thumbnail sketch of what's known as Islamic law. So, first of all, how should we approach the study of Islam? Or for that matter, any religion other than the one which we absorbed with our mother's milk? Well, immediately we should recognize that we are encountering a whole range of potentially very dangerous pitfalls. And we need to frame our interrogations of this unfamiliar religious tradition with very great care. Obviously, our upbringing, the upbringing of the kids that we're teaching, perhaps, didn't just shape our own beliefs, but also shaped some unspoken assumptions about what a proper religion is supposed to be like. These assumptions can often survive quite radical changes in our own intellectual lives simply because we're only vaguely aware of their existence. Let me give you a rather obvious and hackneyed example. Journalists often speak in a very casual but assured way of something called the Islamic clergy. Hardly ever will you see an article about Muslim institutions in today's world without journalists cleverly remarking on the views of the Islamic clergy. Well, this is an example of the error that I have in mind. In Islam, quite simply, there is no clergy. There is an informal body of scholars whose collective opinions are taken to be, in some sense, authoritative, but they are certainly not clergymen in any sense that would be recognized in a traditional Christian society, for instance. They do not administer sacraments. So to use the term clergy when we're talking about an Islamic community is immediately to beg some important questions and to introduce a very dangerous initial misconception. And that's just one example. Unfortunately, very many others could be cited. It warns us, I think, against viewing the other, with a capital O, with spectacles tinted by our own tradition. Now, obviously, we are never going to avoid it completely such a colouring of our vision. That's inescapable. But in general, the rule, I think, is that we are better off using the vocabulary and the categories that are indigenous to another tradition, rather than trying to cut corners by importing words that might be familiar to us or our students, but that might introduce distortions. And comparisons even between two very closely related faiths, such as Islam and Christianity, very often have a nasty habit of distorting more than they enlighten. So once we've identified and tried as much as we're able to neutralize our own cultural assumptions about what a religion is supposed to be, a further and I think even more teasing question remains to be tackled. To what extent can we talk meaningfully about another religion? Well, obviously there are some things that we can do fairly uncontroversially. We can learn about it on a simple factual level, for instance. How do Muslims pray? What are the rules of fasting, etc. We can look at its texts. We can investigate its societies anthropologically. But I think it's important to recognize that no amount of knowledge of, say, the rules of Muslim almsgiving or patterns of kinship amongst Tunisian villages or whatever is really going to disclose to us the true meaning of those things to the believers themselves. What kind of experience is shared by Muslims as they pray or as they fast or as they visit a shrine? And if we can't define that experience, then of what use is our knowledge of the outward manifestations of the religion? To use a traditional image, how can we judge whether the husk, the thing that we see, is doing its job if we can't actually see and inspect the condition of the kernel? One of the great cliches of comparative religion is that the higher aspects of religious experience cannot be conveyed in human language. And it is those higher experiences and conditions of the soul which represent the essence and the purpose of any religion. Perhaps some of you know that the first words of the Taoist scripture is that the Tao that can be spoken is not the true, the eternal Tao. And the same image is commonplace in all of the world's great spiritual literatures. So I think that this should inspire in us a certain due humility, that an academic course on religion, or anything that can be done in schools, has to recognize that we can't grasp the live beating heart of the religion. We can admire its art and its literature, and I certainly think that aesthetics do represent a universal language, that we can authentically grasp something genuine in, say, the Taj Mahal or the Alhambra or any of the great physical manifestations of Islamic culture. I don't think that these things are purely relative. And the Taj Mahal, for instance, might hint to us in some intuitive, discursive language something about the nature of the Muslim soul that designed and commissioned and patronized that building. But a formal lecture such as this, or a class in a school, really can only convey those fairly limited aspects of religion that lie within the grasp of language. Now, I don't think this means that we should give up the effort altogether. After all, we comparative religionists would be out of a job if we said that we can't talk about other religions at all. So generally that's not a conclusion that we invite. Nonetheless, I mention this in order to hopefully induce a sense of humility, that when visiting somebody else's sacred space, we take off our shoes and we acknowledge that there may be things going on that are simply beyond us. And I think it's particularly important to emphasize to students and to young people that a great world religion, any great world religion, is internally coherent, spiritually and morally, and that indeed, were that not the case, it simply wouldn't have survived for so many centuries. So my lectures are going to proceed in this, hopefully, spirit of humility. In other words, on the assumption that there are some things that mere talking about cannot hope to disclose. The core aspects of Islamic experience, whether we believe them to be of divine origin or some kind of psychotropic experience that even the psychologists, frankly, can't agree on. So it is those palpable things, I would suggest, that are the subject of our inquiry. The doctrines of the religion that can be measured and, in a sense, can be assessed for their internal coherence, and sometimes their philosophical validity can be judged from the outside. The ritual practices of the religion, in Islam's case, paradigmatically, the 5 pillars. social organization, and also hints at the spiritual reality of the religion through literature, art, and architecture. Anyway, these questions lead us on to the second large question we have to be asking ourselves. Why study Islam? Is it really worth it? Well, obviously, if you've chosen to attend this course, you've already formulated your own answer to that question. But let me just try and list some reasons, just in case, for instance, you have kids who are not particularly motivated to study it. The most obvious reason is that Islam is quite simply a major fact of world history. In fact, although it's not sufficiently acknowledged, between, say, the 8th and the 16th century, Islam was the dominant civilization on the planet. Dominant in the sense of its demography, of its economic prowess, of its cultural productivity, and also of its universal character. China and India obviously also developed great civilizations at that time, but they were limited within a particular geographical area, whereas Islam was a great sprawling civilization. Christendom, for that period, was confined essentially to the small European appendage to the Old World, while Islam's political orbit embraced a truly gigantic swathe of the planet. Half of Africa, the Middle East, the Indian Ocean, India itself, Central Asia, and Indonesia. Islam, in short, was the great success story of the Middle Ages. Christians, when they interacted with Muslims politically, invariably found themselves up against more powerful, very redoubtable, often palpably and embarrassingly more civilized Muslim neighbors. From Christian Europe, if you went south, you would come to Muslim Spain, whose population in the 11th century was actually greater than all of Christian Europe put together. The biggest city in Europe was Cordoba, under the Muslims, which had over 1 million inhabitants, at a time when the largest Christian city in Europe, Paris, had barely 60,000. To the southeast of Europe, there was, of course, the Middle East itself, and in due season, the very alarming Ottoman presence in the Balkans. It's easy to forget that only 300 years ago, the city of Budapest was a flourishing Muslim city. To the east, where nowadays one generally encounters parts of Russia, there were again powerful, flourishing Muslim states, those referred to by European historians as the Tatar Khanates, the Volga Bulgars, and the Golden Horde. And again, these were far more flourishing in their civilization than their Christian neighbors. Moscow was a fairly small city. Kazan, the great Muslim city on the Volga, was a great center of culture, civilization, etc. So Christendom was more or less encircled, and the only way it could go, of course, was west, which is one reason, of course, why it did just that. So that's one reason why Islam is certainly worth studying. It's of more historical importance to Europeans and to Christians than is any other civilization. Secondly, Islam is of intellectual interest. It's particularly interesting because, like Christianity, it sprang from the same Semitic soil, and it also allowed its dogmas to be shaped by the same categories of Greek philosophy. In fact, Islam is, for these two reasons, more closely related to Christianity than is any other religion, not excepting Judaism. And by seeing how the universal issues and problems raised by the premises of Semitic monotheism, questions of metaphysics, styles of worship, problems about the existence of evil in the world, for instance, mysticism, by looking at how these universal problems were addressed by Muslim thinkers, Christians have historically often found that they can acquire valuable insights and perspectives on their own tradition. This is a very long time-honored process of intellectual dialogue that we find, for instance, at its most prominent in the European Middle Ages, with people like St. Thomas Aquinas, unquestionably the most brilliant medieval European mind. And in his great work, the Summa Theologica, he refers to two individuals more frequently than anybody else. He talks about the philosopher, by whom he means Aristotle, and he talks about the commentator, by whom he means Averroes, who was, in Arabic, Ibn Rushd, the great pious Maliki judge and philosopher of Muslim Cordoba. And there are many aspects of Averroes' philosophy which found their place in the mainstream of medieval Christian thought. So in both of these ways, in terms of political history and intellectual history, Islam inhabits the world of Western Christianity. There has been a genuine overlap. Now this takes us on to the third reason why Islam is worth studying. Islam is a major fact of today's world, merely in demographic terms. At least 62 states now have Muslim majorities, and these include some of the world's most populous countries. The world's fourth most populous country, Indonesia, is a Muslim country with over 200 million Muslims. Other very populous Muslim countries obviously include places like Bangladesh, Pakistan, Egypt, etc. Although no statistics, especially in this area, should be trusted, generally it's assumed that around 1.2 billion human beings today follow the religion of Islam. Hence it's Christianity's nearest numerical rival. Now what's even more striking is that largely because Muslims are the inhabitants of the impoverished third world, this figure is growing rapidly. And demography is one of the great determining facts of the world's cultural and political history. According to one set of figures, specifically those set out, I think, on the basis of some very solid research in something called the Oxford Encyclopedia of World Religions, at the beginning of the present century, the Muslims represented about 12% of the world's population. In 1985, the figure had jumped to 17.1%. By the year 2000, the figure will have reached 19.2%, which is a quite extraordinary rate of proportional increase of around 2.1% in only 15 years, compared with a projected growth for Christianity of only 0.1%. Nor is this rapid growth, of course, confined to majoritarian Muslim countries. No fewer than 38% of the world's Muslims live as minorities. China is home to perhaps 40 million Muslims. India contains well over 100 million Muslims. There are now thriving Muslim communities in countries like Japan and Korea, which 100 years ago quite possibly didn't contain a single Muslim. In the West, too, the Muslim presence is growing very rapidly, largely through natural increase, but also, particularly in places like America and Australia, through immigration and through conversion. In Europe, we have more or less slammed the door in the face of new migration, but it continues in America and Australia. We are told that the Muslim population of the United States has jumped sixfold since 1970. Perhaps 15 million Americans are Muslims, including perhaps 4 or 5 million African Americans. Malcolm X, Muhammad Ali, and now the generally regrettable figure of Mike Tyson are reminders of the continuing vitality and growth of this, what is now a major American religion. Last year, President Clinton held the first ever end of Ramadan celebrations in the White House. In Europe, Islam is the second religion of almost every country, the only exceptions being those countries where it is the majority religion, places like Albania and Azerbaijan, for instance. According to one researcher, 10.3% of the population of Moscow is now Muslim. The other end of the continent, in England, we have towns such as Rochdale, where the majority of the population is now Muslim. There are perhaps 5 million Muslims in France. But astonishing as this might seem, demographic growth and the associated political and cultural backlashes which it's already generating, particularly in Europe, is not the most remarkable aspect of modern Islamic history. Everybody knows that this religion is at present experiencing a vast transformation, revival, according to some people, or according to others, lamentable descent into medievalist obscurantism, fanaticism, and heresy. This huge force is now shaking every single Muslim country, without exception, threatening the pro-Western secular order in countries like Algeria, Egypt, and Turkey, and also having repercussions of quite a significant kind for Muslim communities living in the West. Now, this present-day Muslim resurgence has to be seen as one of the great facts of late 20th century history. With the death of communism, Islam can be seen as the last great, significant transnational ideology which competes with Western capitalism, however we define that. That's not to negate the importance of Christianity. It's simply to point out that Christianity's political and economic impact is in Christian countries far less significant than is Islam's equivalent impact in Muslim lands. A re-Christianization of a Christian country does not have such far-reaching implications as the re-Islamization of a Muslim country, for the obvious reason that Islam includes things like law, which generally are excluded from the traditional concerns of Christian belief. Now, it's true, of course, that this thing we call Islamic fundamentalism, this is a term, by the way, which is an example of how we should not illegitimately import foreign vocabulary into Islamic discourse. It's a journalistic term that scholars do try to avoid. This thing can be seen as part of a more general global revival, which is gripping all religions to some extent. In America, you have things like dear old Jerry Falwell's Moral Majority. In India, you have Hindu revivalist movements such as the Shiv Sena, now achieving considerable political power. But the Muslim modality of this general late 20th century transformation seems to many observers to be more powerful, more successfully transnational, and also more deeply transformative of the cultures in which it appears. And it's clear that the future good order of the world, and certainly the shape of history in the next century, is going to be determined in large measure by the way in which the Muslims themselves develop and exploit for good purposes this development, and also on the reaction that the Western powers are going to have towards it. It's a major determining fact of contemporary realities. Anyway, that's the end of the first introductory two parts of this lecture. I've tried, first of all, to outline the kind of questions we ask about religions we're not familiar with, and I've also set out some of the reasons why Islam is certainly deserving of serious attention. And one reason why I've done this is to try and convince you that Islam is not just another dry academic discipline on the curriculum, but an unusually fascinating topic which is of central importance to today's world. So what I want to do now is sum up some of the very elementary facts we need to know as we embark on the study of Islam, and no doubt this will overlap to some extent with what Dr. Shafi was saying yesterday, but hopefully these things can bear repeating. Firstly, most obviously, what does the word Islam mean? Well, grammatically, it's described as the verbal noun of the fourth derived form of the Arabic verb salima, which means to be safe. Islam, therefore, means to bring oneself into a condition of safety, i.e. protection by the Muslim community, and also safekeeping by God from punishment in the next life. A saying of the Prophet, a hadith, defines a person who is in Islam as he from whose hand and tongue other Muslims are safe. That's the Prophet's definition. But it also has the closely linked sense of submission, i.e. submission to the will of God. The active participle of Islam, the person who does Islam, is Muslim. Muslim is hence somebody who is protected and who is in a state of resigned submission before God. So we find the Quran using the term Muslim sometimes in quite a non-denominational sense. We find Abraham, for instance, being described as a Muslim in the Quran. The Queen of Sheba converts to Islam at the hands of Solomon. In fact, in the Quranic view, all of the prophets have taught Islam in this generic sense, Islam with a small I, if you like. Islam with a capital I, as the historic religion with its recognizable contemporary forms, is the word that we use to refer to the organized religion inaugurated by the Prophet Muhammad. Occasionally you will come across the term Mohammedanism as a synonym for Islam. This is now obsolete, largely because some Muslims are offended by it. The idea is, they claim, that it implies that Muslims worship the founder of their religion as Christians worship the founder of their religion. In fact, of course, the term doesn't necessarily imply that resonance, and we even find references in Muslim literature to al-Ummah al-Muhammadiyah, the Muhammadan community, referring to the collectivity of all Muslims. Nonetheless, the fact is that Muslims don't like the term Mohammedanism, and although you'll see it in a lot of older books, it should not be used. So the religion is called Islam, and for the remainder of today's lecture I'll be outlining its most palpable, salient features. And I say palpable because there are, as I indicated earlier, some hidden spiritual dimensions of the faith which not all Muslims may have attained. There's a very famous hadith, quite possibly the best known of all hadiths, called the Hadith of Gabriel, in which the Prophet states this quite explicitly. I've circulated a translation of this in the handouts, and at the risk of gobbling up quite a bit of time, I think it would actually be good for us to read this out, because it is so fundamental. Any volunteers to read it, to give my vocal cords a rest? Yes, John?
I'll take the first paragraph, and for you want me to do
Fine? Or do the whole thing, as you please.
Umar ibn al-Khattab said, "One day, when we were with God's messenger, we were visited by a man whose garments were exceedingly white and whose hair was exceedingly black, upon whom no signs of travel could be seen. Sitting before the Prophet, leaning his knees against his and placing his hands on his thighs, he said, 'Tell me, Muhammad, about Islam.' The Prophet replied, 'Islam is that you should bear witness that there is no deity but God, and that Muhammad is God's messenger, that you should establish the prayer, pay the zakat, fast in Ramadan, and make the Hajj to the house if you are able to go.' The man said, 'You have spoken truly.' And we were amazed that he should question him and then confirm that he had spoken the truth. He then said, 'Tell me about faith.' Iman. He replied, 'Faith means that you believe in God, His angels, His books, His messengers, and the last day, and that you have faith in the decree, both its good and its evil.' The man said, 'You have spoken truly.' He then said, 'Tell me about excellence.' Ihsan. And he replied, 'Excellence means that you should worship God as if you see Him. For even if you do not see Him, He sees you.' Then the man said, 'Tell me about the hour.' The Prophet replied, 'Concerning that, the one who is questioned knows no more than the questioner.' The man said, 'Tell me then of its four tokens.' He said, 'The slave girl will give birth to her mistress, and you will behold the barefoot, the naked, the destitute, and the shepherds vying with each other in the construction of tall buildings.' Then the man departed. After I had waited for a long time, the Prophet asked me, 'Do you know who the questioner was, Umar?' I replied, 'God and His messenger know best.' He said, 'That was Gabriel, who came to teach you your religion.'"
This is, as I say, possibly the best known of all hadith, and even little kids in Arab countries particularly will know it off by heart. In the hadith, what you can see is that the Prophet, who, like all the founders of the great world religions, was an excellent teacher, is explaining in a systematic, easy to understand fashion the three dimensions of Muslim experience. He also hints at a fourth, the eschatological, the end time prophecy which comes towards the end, which I'm not going to talk about today because I think Dr. Jackson, inshallah, will be addressing it in due course. So what the hadith says is there are three dimensions to the religion. There is Islam, outer practice, the forms, the regulations, the system of worship. There is Iman, which means faith, the belief system, sincerely held. And then there is a third thing, which the Prophet refers to as Ihsan, which means excellence, but in this hadith is clearly defined as spiritual excellence. So in other words, the hadith is making the point that the religion has a dimension proper to the body, to the mind, and to the heart. Now it's easy to see why they should come in this order. From practice, in other words, what we do with the physical body, the easiest bit in religion, we pass on to faith, which dwells in the mind, and thence we pass on to the spiritual life, which exists in the heart. These are progressively more difficult, and while many Muslims achieve outward conformity to the sunnah, the normative practices of the religion, fewer achieve proper, untroubled belief, and still fewer can reach to high spiritual degrees and hope to achieve sainthood. Today I shall be confining myself to a discussion of the first of these three degrees, and in my next lecture tomorrow I'll be tackling the other two. So in the hadith, the Prophet explains that the first, most basic degree is Islam, submission, safety. In another famous hadith, the Prophet defines Islam in this sense as a set of outward activities. The hadith, again I've circulated a copy, is Islam is built on 5 pillars. It is to bear witness that there is no deity but God and that Muhammad is God's messenger, that you should establish the prayer, salat, pay the zakat, fast in Ramadan, and make the hajj to the house, i.e. the Kaaba, if you are able to go. And these are the so-called 5 pillars of Islam. And the metaphor indicates that these things do not constitute the essence of the religion, but merely its necessary supports and foundations. So let's take a look at these one by one. Firstly, the Shahada. Let me inscribe this for you, just in case your Arabic's a bit rusty. Shahada means testifying, bearing witness. Islam prefers to use this expression to say what might be the Christian equivalent of creed. This reflects the Quranic conviction that religious confidence is not something that is so much acquired as innate. One of the key differences between Muslim and Christian theology is that Islam doesn't accept the idea of original sin. Infants are not born in some sinful state. They are born pure. They are made sinful by their circumstances as they grow up. So to carry out the Shahada, to bear witness, is to testify to something that we knew as disembodied souls before we were breathed, as the Quran puts it, into the embryo in our mother's womb. Now this formula, which is probably the most frequently repeated set of words on the planet, is Ashhadu an la ilaha illallah wa ashhadu anna Muhammadan Rasulullah. More simply, La ilaha illallah Muhammadun Rasulullah, which means there is no deity, no object of worship other than the God, Allah. Muhammadun Rasulullah, Muhammad is the messenger of God. Now these words punctuate every dimension of the Muslim life. They're the first words that a baby hears once it's brought into the world. The father whispers the formula into its ear. They are the words that dying Muslims strain to pronounce as they are leaving the world. Simply repeating them to a witness is all that is required to convert to Islam. They are repeated dozens of times a day. They come up in the 5 daily prayers, for instance, and in other situations. You'll see them scribbled by enthusiastic, devout hands on the walls of city buses. You'll see them on coinage and banknotes. You'll see them on the Saudi Arabian flag. If you've seen it, you'll know it's basically a green flag with a sword and there's some Arabic script. This is what it says. You can see them in elaborate calligraphy on bumper stickers. Every Friday sermon begins with these words. Now you can see these, for those who like comparisons, as the Muslim equivalent of the Christian defining symbol of the Christian faith, which is of course the cross. The cross, one of the great symbols of world religions, denotes the intersection of heaven and earth, the vertical and the horizontal. And that's what the Shahada is doing as well. The first phrase of the Shahada affirms a metaphysical, almost hermetic truth. Only God is God. It doesn't attempt a definition of God. Language can't do that. It says there is nothing worthy of worship, nothing worthy of having divinity or ultimate reality attributed to it except the God, except Allah. That's the vertical, metaphysical dimension. And the second is, as it were, the horizontal, which connects the metaphysical to the physical, to the human plane. Muhammadur Rasulullah, Muhammad is the messenger of God. He is the one that connects heaven with earth. So this phrase, rather than any visible symbol, is, if you like, the representation of the religion of Islam. Sometimes people think that the crescent and star are the symbol of the Islamic religion, and they have become so in many Muslim societies. You'll see them on top of minarets, domes, tombs, etc. But in fact, the crescent is not the defining symbol of Islam in the way that the cross is for Christianity. The crescent, in fact, was not used as a symbol for the religion until the 15th century. This is as far as we can discern. Although we find crescents in fairly old Islamic fabrics and textiles, it denoted the religion of Islam on a sort of reliable and definitive basis only following the Ottoman conquest of Constantinople in 1453. Because the symbol of the city of Constantinople is the crescent. And the reason for that is that it has Marian associations. The Cathedral Church of Constantinople, Hagia Sophia, the Holy Wisdom, is dedicated to the Blessed Virgin. And in Christian iconography, the crescent is often associated with the Virgin because she is Queen of Heaven. So blue is her colour, there are stars, and she stands sometimes on a crescent moon. So the Ottoman Turks adopted the symbol of the city of Constantinople, which was now their capital, as the emblem of their state and hence by extension of the religion of Islam. Among Shia Muslims, you won't find the crescent, but quite often you will find a hand. You'll see it on top of a dome or a minaret. And this is the hand of the Prophet's daughter Fatima. And it has a number of spiritual symbolic significances, the most obvious of which is that the 5 pillars of Islam are represented by the hand, with the Shahada, this first pillar, being the thumb, without which the other 4 fingers are not operable. So this is the defining symbol of Islam. And just as the crucifix tends to articulate sacred space in Christian architecture, this intersection, this cruciform aspect of belief also determines mosque architecture. In building mosques, Muslims have done all kinds of things. Actually, mosques are more diverse generally in their architecture than a church is. If you go to a mosque in Nigeria, for instance, it'll look like a traditional Nigerian building, mud brick and so forth. If you visit a church in Nigeria, it will tend to approximate to the Gothic church architecture of Europe or America. Nonetheless, Muslims have tended to gravitate towards a particular form when designing mosques. And this is, of course, the cube surmounted by the hemisphere or the dome. That's the classic style of mosque. And this is a representation in visual form of the Shahada. The cube represents the earth because it's the 4 points of the compass. It's the material world, hence it's the second Shahada. And the first one, the metaphysical truth, is represented by the heavens, hence the dome. And there's even a developed theory, for instance, in Islamic calligraphy, which holds that there are vertical strokes in the Arabic script and there are horizontal movements, and the vertical represents divine intervention in human history as it progresses, and the horizontal represents humanity's progress through history. So again, you have these 2 fundamental beliefs invoked in Islamic art. Also, this polarity exists in the distinction between the 2 principal sacred cities of Islam, which are Mecca and Medina. Mecca was the place where the revelation descended, first of all, on the Prophet. The metaphysical verses of the Quran were made manifest there. The Kaaba is the image of the divine throne, and the pilgrims milling around it recall the adoring angels. Of course, the Kaaba is also the archetype for the mosque because it's a cube. It doesn't have a dome because the heaven itself, the hemisphere, is above it. Medina is the locus of the Sharia. It is where the formal practices and laws of the religion were revealed to the Prophet. Hence, it's the city of the Prophet. He's buried there. And it's the city of the second Shahada. So devotional poetry about Mecca, written by Muslims, tends to focus on God. Devotional poetry about Medina tends to focus on the Prophet. So, by uttering these few words, one affirms one's full membership of Islam. But although the theologians aver that because of God's mercy, however much one sins, one cannot be punished eternally, if one has affirmed this Shahada, it's recognized that one's Islam is gravely lacking if one goes no further. You have to accept the entailment of Muhammad's prophecy, the other 4 pillars. These are the fingers to the Shahada's thumb. The second pillar of Islam is, of course, in Arabic, salat, usually translated not very comfortably in English as the prayer with a capital P. In a sense, it isn't really primarily a prayer, it's a kind of worship. It's an act of worship, it's a formal submission and adoration of the divine. This is the formal 5 times daily worship that you'll see going on in the mosque here. It's the key religious practice of Islam, more important than the others. The Prophet called it the center pole of the religion. Whoever demolishes it has demolished Islam. The basic meaning of this word salat in Arabic is a kind of connection, a connection through prayer or blessing or an association with holiness. So in the Quran we find that God and his angels also engage in a kind of salat in the sense of blessing mankind. Surah 33 verse 43 says, "It is he, i.e. God, who performs the salat over you and his angels that he may bring you forth from darkness into light." In another passage, the Quran affirms that salat is actually the practice and the norm of all creatures. Surah 24 verse 41 says, "Have you not seen that everything in the heavens and the earth glorifies God, and the birds spreading their wings? Each one knows its salat and its glorification." And elsewhere, Surah 21 verse 73, for instance, the text declares that earlier prophets, such as Abraham and Lot, also performed salat. So this Quranic model shows that the term itself actually has a very wide application, and that the formal worship which is instituted in Islam is simply the Muslim extension of a universal cosmic pattern in which God, the angels, the creatures, and all earlier prophets have all participated. So what's the specifically Muslim form of this universal practice? Well, the hadith outline it in some detail. Generally, the Quran lays down guidelines and global principles, and the detailed working out of these principles are in the hadith. So you won't find a description of how to do the salat in the Quran. The objective is to pray as the Prophet himself prayed. And one of the interesting things about Muslim worship is that if you go into a mosque, the rituals you will see have remained unchanged for 1400 years. You are seeing, as it were, a glimpse of the distant past. Now, the characteristically Muslim form of salat is something that acknowledges the mutual interdependence of the body and the soul. These two things are in the Islamic vision closely intertwined. Islamic civilization has never accepted the Cartesian body-soul or mind-soul or mind-body dichotomy. What you do to the body has an effect on the soul and vice versa. And the Prophet said that man is closest to his Lord when in prostration. And this is the culminating rite of the salat, the act of touching one's forehead to the earth, this humble matter from which we were made and to which we will return. And in the Semitic tradition, generally the forehead is the symbol of pride. So this culminating act of the prayer represents the quintessence of Islam, submission to the omnipotent, majestic celestial king. This prostration, sajda, is the culmination of the salat. It happens several times during each cycle of prayer. Each cycle is called rak'ah. I don't think there's that much point in going through the detailed rulings on how to do the prayer here. You can learn it probably more efficiently just by watching what goes on in the mosque. Very briefly, though, the salat works as follows. Before you can pray, and also before you recite the Quran, the Muslim has to ensure that he or she is physically clean from any bodily wastes, which is why in Muslim communities, Muslim houses, Muslim countries, water is always provided in bathrooms. Using paper or whatever is not considered sufficient. You have to be completely clean. Even one drop of waste matter on the body will render the prayer null and void. This again has certain symbolic significance, the body being a metaphor for the soul. Once this has been done, there is the rite of wudu, which is the formal washing that takes place before the prayer can be done. And this is a very brief, concentrated, stylized, almost Zen-like ritual in which the hands, the forearms, the face, the ears and the feet all have to be cleansed with pure running water. The symbolism of this obviously is obvious. As in Christianity, the rite of baptism uses water as an image of divine mercy, water being what comes from heaven. But the rite has a practical significance as well. Physical cleanliness in a mosque is extremely important because close physical proximity is normal. So to supply clean water for these ablutions, mosques have fountains in their courtyard, or at least they'll have a row of taps. Water is also required for the hammam, the public bath, which until very recently in Muslim communities was a very important feature of life, the famous Turkish bath. And it's an interesting fact that historians are only just beginning to recognize that one reason why medieval Muslim cities were so big, I mentioned that Cordoba had 1 million people in it, whereas medieval cities in Northern Europe had a lot fewer, was the very practical consequence of the liturgical requirement that clean water be delivered to the city. Whenever Muslims captured a town or founded a town, the first thing they had to do was to establish a place of worship. Before they could worship, they had to have clean water that didn't taste of anything, that didn't smell. These are the canonical requirements. And the provision of clean running water was in Muslim societies a very important means of circumventing some waterborne diseases, so that cholera and various kinds of plagues were actually less common in medieval Muslim societies than they were elsewhere. It wasn't just Cordoba, places like Baghdad, Cairo, and a few other cities also had well over 1 million inhabitants. Anyway, that's by way of a footnote. Once the wudu is completed, one recites the Shahada, and then the Muslim is in the state of what's academically referred to as ritual purity. And this state enables him to approach the sacred. He or she can touch a copy of the Quran, can enter the sanctuary in Mecca, and can perform the salat. It's perhaps a Cambridge vice, by the way, that I use the male pronoun. But the important point to bear in mind is that the 5 pillars of Islam are equally incumbent on both of the sexes. Even the Hajj, which often is more difficult for women than it is for men, is just as incumbent for women as it is for men. So how does the prayer itself work? Well, it doesn't have to take place in a mosque. There is no rite of consecration. The prayers we do in the mosque here could just as easily be done outside in the car park. It's just that a mosque is a special place where it's easier to concentrate on the divine and excludes other more profane activities. The worshipper has to stand in a clean place, hence shoes which can bring in impurity. Sorry.
I have a point of clarification.
Mm-hmm.
As a practical matter, I wouldn't think most people pray in the mosque 5 times a day. Is that correct? I mean, if you're going about your business and the shop's closed or something,
Right.
you might simply pray there. Would that not be correct?
It depends very much where you are. In some countries like Saudi Arabia, they actually close the shops at the time of prayer.
And is this ritual cleansing done? Is it a requirement every time?
Not every time, no. It's preferable to do it every time, but the ritual purity is actually broken if you go to the toilet. You have to do it again if you've discharged bodily wastes. That's the rule. But generally people can pray 2 or 3 prayers together, and maybe they'll do the wudu 2 or 3 times a day, depending. But although the prayer doesn't have to be done in the mosque, generally people prefer it, and the Prophet explained that it's more meritorious to do it in congregation. Generally, it's easier to concentrate somehow if other people are doing the same thing as you are. But very often you'll find, yes, a majority of at least the male population will be praying in the mosques 5 times a day. In Saudi Arabia, for instance, I would attend just a little local mosque that was around the corner from me, and at the dawn prayer you would have about 400 or 500 people there, which would probably represent about half of the population of the street. And in villages as well, in villages, certainly the majority of the population will attend. Women can attend mosques, and most mosques provide space for women, including the sacred mosques, Mecca, Medina and Jerusalem. But there is a dispensation. They're not obliged to. It's not quite as important for them as it is for men, because they have family responsibilities as well in the traditional view of things. Although women are attending mosques a lot more than they used to. Does that answer your question? Okay. Briefly, to run over the actual mechanics of the prayer. You have to stand in a clean place. The only place you can't pray, by the way, is in a lavatory or a bathroom. You have to face the Kaaba in Mecca, which is the earthly symbol of the divine presence. And the prayer actually begins when the worshipper raises his or her hands flat behind the ears and then brings them down like this, Allahu Akbar, and usually crosses them on the chest, although sometimes, particularly in North Africa, you'll see people with their hands by the side. Both are perfectly acceptable. And this word Allahu Akbar that begins the prayer, this phrase means God is greater. Again, it's one of these slightly hermetic utterances that Islam likes. La ilaha illallah, no God but God. Allahu Akbar, God is greater. Greater than what? Well, obviously greater than everything. So when you're doing this, Allahu Akbar, it's as if you're affirming or reaffirming the fact that the divine reality is what is really important and greater than whatever you've been doing in the previous few hours. And this practice is, as it were, a symbol of pushing behind you all of the things that might have been occupying your mind and your soul. Once this is done, the worshipper recites the first surah of the Quran, the famous Fatiha. That's an obligation in the prayer. And then he will say Ameen, or the members of the congregation will say Ameen, which is just the Arabic version of Amen, means the same. And then will recite any other passage of the Quran that he or she chooses. During the second and third prayers of the day, those are the prayers done at noon and mid-afternoon, and also in all optional prayers, the recitation is done silently. Otherwise it's aloud, i.e. the dawn prayer, sunset prayer and the night prayer are said aloud. All Quranic recitation has to be done in Arabic because this links the worshipper to the actual sound and form of the pre-existent divine word. Arabic is a sacred language. Once the Quranic recitation is completed, he or she says Allahu Akbar again and bows down in the position known as ruku', hands on knees. There you repeat the phrase Subhana Rabbil Azim, which means glory be to my Lord, the tremendous, 3 or more times. Then he stands again and then goes down into the prostration. And during the prostration, people say all kinds of things, but the Prophet recommended things like Subhana Rabbil A'la, glory be to my Lord, the Most High. Then he sits back on his haunches and repeats another brief formula or prayer and then prostrates again. And once that second prostration is over, then the first rak'ah, or cycle of prayers, has been completed. And the number of rak'ahs in each prayer differs. There are 2 in the dawn prayer, 4 in the noon, afternoon and night prayer, and 3 in the sunset prayer. So the 5 daily prayers are, just to reiterate, first of all, the dawn prayer, which is between first light and sunrise. The second is shortly after noon. Second is mid-afternoon. Third is mid-afternoon, rather. Fourthly, sunset. And fifthly, nightfall. That's when it's completely dark, say an hour and a half after the sun sets. The actual length of the thing, it's perfectly possible to finish a prayer in 2 minutes and be out of the mosque again. 5-10 minutes is more usual. Again, the imams in different mosques will have different ways of doing things. And in Muslim cities where there are lots of mosques within walking distance, people will, depending on the amount of time they've got, go to the mosque where they know the service is going to be long or short, or where they like the sound of the recitation or whatever. One can do these things very briefly, and it depends really on one's circumstances. I remember once I was waiting at a railway station in Yugoslavia. This was about 3-4 years ago. And it was 5 in the morning, and the train wasn't coming for hours. And so I thought, well, I'll do the dawn prayer. And so there I was on my little prayer carpet, nobody around, and I thought, I can make this a nice long prayer. And then into the station steamed this filthy train full of about maybe 5,000 Serbs who looked pretty drunk, I could see out of the corner of my eye. And I thought perhaps this is not the best sight for a group of angry young Serbs. And so I did what was probably the most rapid performance of the Muslim prayer in recorded history and disappeared. But so the actual length of it is at people's discretion depending on mood and situation. Now, this is the obligatory prayer, 5 of them every day, but there are a lot of optional prayers, and these are taken very seriously. You'll see in the mosque here, people don't just do the congregational prayer in the line. Once that's finished, or before it starts, they'll scatter into other parts of the mosque and pray separately. There are other times of day when the Prophet also liked to pray, and pious Muslims like to emulate these. For instance, most importantly, something called the Tahajjud prayer. This is said in the middle of the night. People wake up for it. My mother-in-law, for instance, who's from Pakistan, I've lived in her house for some time and observed her movements. Every night she gets up at about 2 a.m, makes herself a cup of tea, and then prays this Tahajjud prayer for a couple of hours, and then goes to sleep again for an hour or so before the dawn prayer. And in her social world, that's very normal. The Tahajjud prayer can be a very large number of rak'ahs. You can recite very long surahs of the Quran. More or less you can do what you like. And this is generally the prayer that is taken most seriously by very devout, spiritually minded Muslims. The formal congregational prayers during the day are an important assertion of communal solidarity, the equality of believers, etc., etc. But the tahajjud is when the real spiritual work is traditionally done. It's done usually at home. Occasionally, and in some mosques, there is a form of tahajjud prayer that's done in congregation. For mosques where there's a very strong interest in nocturnal vigils. And you'll see this during the month of Ramadan in the great mosque in Mecca. If you turn up there at about 3 a.m. during Ramadan, you'll see perhaps 500,000 people all doing tahajjud together. And it's actually very impressive. Most things about Mecca are just visually stunning. And I remember the first time I got there, I was pretty late and the prayer had almost finished. And I couldn't believe it, but I could hardly find a place in this mosque, which has, its official capacity is about 700,000. But in reality, it gets pretty crowded and probably you get 1 million people in there. And I could hardly find a place to stand. And I was there at 3 a.m, went up one of the escalators. There are 24 huge escalators that take you up to the roof because there's no room downstairs or on the first floor. So you have 250,000 people praying on the roof. Found myself a little space at the back, and I saw that the floor was actually wet, and I thought, it's been raining, that's pretty weird for Mecca. And after 5 minutes or so, I realized it was because so many people were crying. The force of the occasion, the awe that they felt before God's house, the holy month, the effect of the fasting, the recitation of the Quran overpowered people, and many of them were actually in tears. So it's a very, very powerful thing. Other optional prayers, there's something called the Duha prayer, which some people do, that's D-U-H-A, which is said in the mid-morning. Another optional prayer. Another one called the Awabin, which is said between the sunset and night prayers. On Fridays, there is the congregational prayer that comes complete with a sermon. Not to everybody's delight, but one listens to it. The Prophet said that this should be short, but in reality, it's sometimes longer than some people would wish. Some things, it seems, are common to all religions. And this is an obligation. While it's strongly recommended to attend the 5 daily prayers in congregation, it's an obligation to attend the Jummah, a Friday prayer. Jummah, yeah.
That's the Friday.
That's the Friday congregational prayer, which takes the place of the noon prayer. Jummah just means assembly or congregation. This little squiggle here is a kind of glottal stop. Arabic has a lot of sounds like that, which we can't represent very easily in English. What does the mosque actually look like? Well, it has very few features that one really needs to know about. I've said that the classical form of it is the cube surmounted by a dome, which is a favoured form in Islamic architecture generally, like this room, for instance. It has something called a mihrab. The word means a niche, and this is the little alcove which indicates the direction of Mecca, so that people don't pray towards Pittsburgh or whatever. In the United States, I'm reliably informed the Qibla, the direction of Mecca, is actually towards the north. There's also something called the minbar, which you'll see in almost all mosques, including our one here. A minbar is a pulpit where the imam stands to deliver his Friday disquisition. Traditionally, the imam doesn't stand at the top of it. There's a tradition that only the Prophet could stand at the top, and out of respect for his memory, the imam stands on a lower stair. Minaret is not necessary at all in a mosque, although it's traditional. In fact, the original mosque founded by the Prophet in Mecca didn't have a minaret. The aesthetic of mosques does vary hugely, as I've said. There are mosques in China that look almost indistinguishable from Confucian temples, and so on. The collective prayer has to be led by an imam. The word simply means somebody who goes out in front. So the word can also have political meanings. The imam of a state, for instance, is the head of the state, somebody who's in front of the rest. He is not an ordained minister in any sense, because there are no sacraments that he's administering, no communion, no baptism, or whatever. So any adult member of the congregation can serve as imam, as long as he can recite the Quran coherently. His function basically is largely to mark time, so that people are doing the same thing at the same time, to ensure the proper coordination of the movements of the congregation. But since part of his responsibility is to recite the Quran in a beautiful, mellifluous voice, which is something that the Prophet himself insisted on, usually somebody is chosen who has a good voice and has memorized a lot of the Quran. Very often you'll find it's somebody who's memorized the entire Quran. Such a person being known as a hafiz, meaning a memorizer or a container. Estimated there are 3 million of these in the Muslim world. It's a traditional accomplishment. Overwhelmingly, the consensus of Islamic law is that the imam of a mosque, if it's a male or a mixed congregation, has to be male. There is the beginnings of an argument now akin to the argument over the ordination of women in Christianity, although obviously it's not an exact parallel because there's no ordination, no sacraments to dish out. There are a few medieval scholars who say that women can lead men in prayer, but their views are very rarely heeded. 1 or 2 mosques in South Africa, I think, where they have women imams. But women can lead other women in prayer. Congregational prayer is famously announced to the community, not by bells, but by this chant known as the adhan, or the call to prayer, which is sung out by the mu'adhin from traditionally atop a minaret. And I've included a transliteration and an English translation in the handouts. You should note that the adhan for the dawn prayer adds the words as-salatu khayrun min an-nawm, which means prayer is better than sleep. Congregational prayer, as I've said, doesn't have to be in a mosque. Very often if you travel through rural districts in the Muslim world where people have been working in the fields, you'll see they just put out a few sheets of cardboard and pray by the side of the road or by the side of their fields. A hadith says, "The whole world is pure and has been made a mosque for my community." Interestingly, the Saudi Prince Salman, who was allegedly the first Muslim in space, had no trouble saying his prayers aboard the space shuttle. But typically very crowded places like railway stations, public libraries, universities, airports will have mosques attached. There's even a mosque at Heathrow Airport in London, for instance, which is quite well used. Beautiful mosque at Amsterdam Airport now. People develop a very deep attachment to the Salat prayer. It becomes something people really look forward to, the thing in which they find the vertical and horizontal dimensions of life reconciled and resolved. Ordinary believers regard it as a means of pleasing God, of atoning for sin, and of praising God. Political zealots nowadays might see it as an expression primarily of Muslim solidarity. Many of these activists are more interested in the political possibilities of the formal forms of religion than in their spiritual ones. Mystical Muslims will see it primarily as a ladder of ascent by which we reach God. Quoting the hadith, the salat is the ascension, the mi'raj of the believer. There's much more I could say about the salat, but I'll leave it for now. That's all I really wanted to say about the second pillar of Islam. The third pillar mentioned in this hadith of Gabriel is the zakat. Quite easy to remember these two since they rhyme, often coupled in the Quran. This is a kind of religious tithe. Now, just as there is an obligatory and a spontaneous form of the salat, so also there is an obligatory and a spontaneous optional form of charity. The Quran frequently enjoins Muslims to give sadaqah, which means charity generically, including the formal form of zakat. And it recommends that they be given in secret. But it also requires more formally the giving of this zakat, which is a kind of alms tax. The word itself means purity, and a number of hadiths indicate that one's wealth, one's money and property are not considered pure unless one has shared them in a divinely appointed proportion with the needy. Only when one has discharged this responsibility can one enjoy one's possessions in good conscience. The word zakat also means growth, referring to the Prophet's insistence that no fortune ever diminished through charity. In other words, the idea is if you give, God will be pleased and will give you even more. The hadith, as incorporated into the classical canonical manuals of Islam, explains that the basic rate of zakat is 2.5%. This is a percentage not of income, but of actual wealth. In other words, at the end of each year, every Muslim has to tot up the value of whatever assets he owns, whether in cash or other forms of assets, and pay a 40th to charity. Some assets are actually exempt. For instance, if you own a house for your own use, you're not obliged to give 2.5% of its value away each year. That would be considered too onerous. But if you own an extra house, for instance, in order to make a profit selling it, then it's considered to be a zakatable asset, the word which unfortunately some Muslims in the West are now using. Quite convenient, perhaps. On certain categories, for instance, some forms of crops and some precious metals and precious stones, the rate can go up, for instance, to 10%. The actual process of donation has typically been left to the individual, although the Quran seems to suggest that it is best supervised by the state. Today in the Muslim world, some governments collect it by the rather hit-and-miss method of adding it to income tax. But given the notorious inefficiency of some state bureaucracies in the third world, this is pretty unpopular. Some countries have made it work well. For instance, in Malaysia, if you're a Muslim, it's automatically added to your income tax every year, and the state allocates it to charitable purposes of various kinds. The problem with that is that it obliges the tax collector, sometimes by his nature not the most discerning of individuals, responsible for deciding whether a taxpayer is Muslim or Christian or something else, and that adds an extra complication. Yep.
Yeah, that was my question. Like, if you're living in Malaysia and they take it out of your income tax, I know that not. How do they do that if you're a Christian living in Malaysia or if you're a Buddhist or something?
If you're not a Muslim, you don't pay it.
Okay, and how do they determine that? Is that on the census or is there some?
I haven't seen the Malaysian tax form, but I assume that the government has central
But
records and
obsessive
people
setups,
declare
okay.
themselves. Yeah. But as I said, in most Muslim countries, it's actually left to the individual, partly for these administrative reasons. So usually it's a private affair. Sometimes the sums involved can be fairly massive. The Sultan of Brunei, for instance, who is reputed to be the richest man in the world, even outgunning Bill Gates, is reputed to pay $600 million a year in zakat. And he does do at least some of that, because when I was doing relief work in Bosnia, I would see the Bruneians, even though it's a tiny state, actually dishing out a lot of relief effort. And they do humanitarian educational projects amongst Muslims, particularly in places like England. In England, it's been calculated that the total zakat payable by the Muslim community is about £700 million. Most of this goes as remittances to family members. It's permissible, even encouraged, to start with the poor in your own family. So this will go as remittances back to poor relations in Pakistan or Bangladesh. I'm sure the same kind of thing happens in the States. There are also Muslim charities which accept zakat. Many mosques in the West have their own zakat funds. You'll see a large chest with a slit in it in the mosque where people drop their checks or their cash. And needy individuals can apply to the mosque administration for a handout from those funds. That's really all I think I need to say about the zakat. It's fairly self-explanatory. Yes?
Sorry, could you elaborate how much, because you just kind of answered part of that question, but how do mosques obtain some funds?
Because there will be a collection box in the
there
mosque,
is
or people will send a check at the end of each year
And
to the
that's
mosque
in addition
committee.
to this?
That will be people's zakat. For instance, if my salary is $100,000 a year, I will be paying $2,500 every year, assuming that was my the sum total that remained to me at the end of the year, and I could give that to the mosque to be dished out in the local community. And,
Who administers the mosque? That's a fun question.
okay, that's another useful point. There is no canonical guidance on how a mosque is to be administered. In a lot of Muslim countries, particularly nowadays, the state keeps an eye on the mosques and appoints salaried imams. For instance, in Egypt, 10 years ago, the government nationalized all of the mosques. The reason for this being not zeal for the propagation of correct doctrine, but simply to ensure that the government wasn't being criticized by radicals from the pulpit. So they dish out approved subjects for each Friday sermon, and that's regrettably quite common in the Muslim world nowadays. And I've seen in one mosque in Cairo, near the loudspeaker, mosques tend to be big, so they use sound systems, there's always a guy who obviously doesn't fit in because he doesn't quite know what to do. Obviously from the secret police, and he has a jacket, obviously some kind of automatic weapon under his armpit. And if he hears something he really doesn't agree with, it's known that he will pull the plug on the sound system, and the imam will probably go to jail, regrettably. But it is one of the traditional responsibilities of the imam of a mosque is to draw attention to official abuse and corruption. In the West, mosques are administered generally as private charities or trusts with a management committee and subcommittees and so forth, rather as any other small charity, or perhaps even as some small autonomous Christian denominations would be run. But there is no overarching hierarchy, for instance, in the United States, no hierarchy of bishops, an archbishop and so forth. Mosques and Muslim communities generally tend to be quite jealous of their own independence. They like to do their own thing, which has advantages and has drawbacks. It means that unity on any particular issue is difficult. When the media want to know the American Muslim view on such and such a subject, who do they turn to? With Christians it's easy, you just interview the bishop. With Muslims, well, you've got 10,000 different mosques probably all saying different things. So it's a drawback in that sense, but it also has the unquestionable advantage of ensuring a certain freedom of conscience. Mosques can do their own thing, and there's no orthodoxy being imposed from above. Yeah.
Getting back to the money. In a place like Malaysia or Egypt then, where the zakat may be intermingled with tax revenues, is there any watchdog on the state to make sure they're not buying tanks and bombs and stuff like that rather than giving money to...
Generally there is, yeah. It's something they do take seriously. For instance, in Egypt, the government has its own bank called the Nasser Social Bank or something, and that's where all of the zakat funds go when they're separated out from people's income tax returns, and they do social projects, and generally it's poorly administered, as such things tend to be in the third world. And most people wish that they could just give out their zakat according to their own consciences. But again, the governments tend to have an interest in not allowing that, because people might be donating for things that the government doesn't approve of. Radical groups, publications that don't support the regime, whatever. It's a regrettable fact of life in the modern Muslim world that everything is very politicized, and the government likes to get in on the act, even in these aspects of religion that are supposed to be individual or small community concerns.
So this is really, I'm looking at this as, it's one of the disadvantages of not separating church and state in the Islamic system. I mean, since they don't have a separation, there's room for, well, lots of corruption, it would seem.
Oh, there's room for abuses,
Yeah.
certainly. It's generally an oversimplification to say that Islam is a theocratic system.
I'm not trying to say that. but
Yeah,
there's-
there's a common perception that there's no distinction between religion and the state, and the religion is the state. The head of state is like a great archbishop who defines doctrine as well as economic policy. Traditionally, Muslim societies haven't worked like that at all. The religious hierarchy, in as much as it has existed, which means not clerics but experts in the law and in theology, have often existed very separately from the state and even in an antagonistic relationship to it. And the state has always been regarded as a kind of rather vulgar thing, sort of fat sultans and corrupt people that religious people don't have much to do with. So the idea that Islamic civilization is naturally theocratic simply isn't borne out by the patterns of Muslim history. But it's a possible source of corruption, but also many Muslims would say that unless you have religious people supervising these things according to proper religious guidelines, everything's going to be done according to people's own personal interests, and so it's necessary that religion dirties its hands, as it were, with politics, because otherwise the public interest will not be served. Yeah.
In the United States,
Is the zakat collected only in the mosque? I think you said earlier there was a chest where people put their money. That would assume that there's an honor system that, for example, in your example where you said $100,000, $2,500, that would assume that you would give that much money without anyone checking on you or knowing, as you might have a country where there's a form where you fill it out on your tax return.
But there's no system of checking, certainly not, and probably only a small percentage of Muslims here do pay the full whack.
And then there really wouldn't be a list of the congregation, then, would there? Or would there?
I don't know what the situation is here, but in England...
They're very good at getting
Yeah.
lists and knowing who's there, and you get your little box of envelopes and, and
In England, you'll find some mosques which accommodate very closely knit communities. For instance, if a whole village from Kashmir has moved to an area in Oxford, everybody knows each other. They will have a list of everybody. But I think Hakim... Perhaps Hakim could interject something.
yeah, that's true, a place like that.
In America, you'll find sort of variations on that. In some cases, people are on an honor system in which they give their zakat independently. And traditionally, there are 8 categories in which zakat is meant to be given, with priorities, categories beginning in your immediate neighborhood and so forth. And there are 8 traditional categories in which you pay your zakat. In some communities in America, you'll have more organized communities in which they actually collect the zakat, and they go up to the members of the community who are known and actually collect, and they will help them determine what their income is. And then that group that's appointed amongst them will pay out amongst the community to those 8 categories. So it's a little bit of variation. Generally, it's done independently. A few exceptions.
Okay, do you want to?
Is it one lump sum, or is it, can it be dispersed throughout the year? And also, if it is paid one lump sum, is there a specific time of the year in which it is paid?
The traditional arrangement is that it's paid, usually people pay at the end of Ramadan. Sometimes people will do it according to the end of the Muslim year, the beginning of the month of Muharram. But it is permissible just to pick one time of the year. Maybe Abdul Hakim Jackson has better insight since he's an expert in Islamic law, but as I understand it, there's no specific month or date when the zakat has to be calculated and coughed out.
Actually, it's a very individualistic type of obligation. It's between the individual and God. It's not a right to the state. It's actually a right to the poor. It's an obligation that God places on the more fortunate members of the community to share His bounty with the less fortunate members of the community. And so actually what happens is that it's not an income tax. It's a tax on assets, like he said. So for example, there's a threshold point. You have to have so much in savings that you sustain over a year. And at the end of that year, you pay 2.5% of those savings. So say, for example, I don't know what professor salaries are in England, but they're not $100,000 a year. But let's say I have a savings of $1,000 or say $5,000. Let's say I come to some money today. Well, I have to sustain and that money is over, I think the threshold level is about $150, between $150 and $175. So let's say I come into $5,000 today. If I sustain that over a year, on this date next year, I'll have to pay 2.5% of that. Okay? But if, for example, before that year expires, my kid falls down, chips a tooth, has to go to the dentist, then I have to spend that money for some legitimate need for my family, because my family comes first, then if that money drops below the threshold, then I'm not obliged to pay at the end of the year. And I have to wait till my savings goes back up above the threshold, it's sustained for a year, and then I pay. So it's not designed to, to be a burden on the community. It's designed really for those people whom God has blessed to have enough sort of disposable income over a sustained period of time, and they take from that to help out the poor and needy.
Is this an individual or is it family? Per family or per individual?
No, per individual. My wife's, in Islamic law, my wife's wealth is her wealth, and I don't have control over that. So she may end up paying zakat where I don't have to pay zakat, or I may end up having to pay zakat where she doesn't have to pay zakat, depending on what the situation might be.
Can we move on now, perhaps? I want to get the other two pillars out of the way before. It's a useful intervention. Thank you for that. Before we break for coffee, I'll try and whiz through the last two pillars. Pillar number 4 is fasting in Ramadan. This is the 9th month of the Muslim calendar, and complicatedly enough, the Muslim calendar is a lunar calendar. Each month begins with the sighting of the new crescent moon. And this means that the Muslim year of 12 of these months is a little bit shorter than the Gregorian calendar. It's about 355 and a bit days. So what this means is that the month of Ramadan falls a little bit earlier each year. So sometimes it's in the summer, sometimes in the winter. At the moment it falls in the month of January. In northern latitudes, obviously, the fast is sometimes going to be a lot longer than it is in equatorial regions, because it's a dawn to dusk fast. In England, I remember 15, 16 years ago, the fast was in the summer, and we were starting the fast at 2:30 a.m., and then we would slump in front of the television watching cricket all day, and fortunately the test matches go on quite late in the evening. And then we would break the fast at 9:45 in the evening. Now that seems to be onerous, but in fact there's a kind of balance involved, because in equatorial regions the real problem is not the time but the heat. You get thirsty. Whereas in England, generally you don't get thirsty. So there's a kind of compensation now. Obviously there are exemptions if you're a quarry worker or you're a pregnant woman, for instance, or a number of other things. Or also, many people will say if you're about to take exams, you're exempted from fasting. And you can do various things like either making up the fast later in the year, or you can pay a cash equivalent to the poor. The actual sighting of the moon is a notorious controversy in Muslim communities, particularly in the West. The traditional schools of Islamic law insist that the crescent moon has to be physically sighted, and that the fasting month begins at dawn the following day. Increasingly in the Muslim world, people are using computer calculations and tables from observatories to work this out. But a traditional scene in a Muslim village, for instance, would be people going out after the sunset prayer and going up on top of a local hill, or even sitting on the roof of the mosque, and they sit around and drink tea and they look for the moon, and it's quite a festive occasion. Once one member of the community has sighted the moon, then Ramadan begins and the fast commences the next morning. The fast, as I said, is from first light, which is when the horizon first becomes visible, which is the time when the first adhan of the day is given. And it ends at sunset with the adhan for the sunset prayer. In a lot of Muslim countries, they have a canon that announces the exact moment when you can start drinking your can of Coke or whatever it is you wish to break the fast with. In Muslim cities in Ramadan, you can sometimes see large ceremonial cannons mounted in public parks and so forth, and they emit a satisfying bang at precisely the right moment. The rules of the fast are While fasting, Muslim men and women equally are required to abstain from food, drink, smoking, and all sexual relations. But there are a number of other dimensions. The hadith also urge more rigorous observance of the rules of right conduct. For instance, we find a hadith saying 5 things break the fast: lying, backbiting, slander, swearing, and looking with lust. The purpose of fasting is really not different from the purpose of fasting in other religions, and I think all the major world religions have rites of fasting. The purpose is quite simply to briefly cut the believer off from physical ties to the world. Like the angels, the fasting person neither eats nor drinks. The aim is to create a sense of aloofness and independence from material passions and pleasures, enabling one to focus on God without distraction. More practically, it has the effect of teaching the wealthy what it's like to be hungry, thereby inculcating a sense of solidarity and charity. Partly for this reason, there's a special form of zakat which is given at the end or towards the end of the month of Ramadan called the zakat al-fitr. So we'll write this out. Again, an obligation, not onerous. It's calculated at approximately 3 litres of wheat or barley for every man, woman and child in a household. Literalist Muslims will say the Prophet gave it in wheat and barley, therefore we have to. So sometimes in Ramadan in Muslim cities you'll see people sitting out selling piles of wheat and barley. But increasingly nowadays people will just give a cash equivalent. In Ramadan, charitable and family activities are hugely important. The fast-breaking meal at sundown, the iftar, that's I-F-T-A-R, is a major social occasion. Typically, some of the men in the family will break the fast at the mosque by eating a few dates and perhaps a gulp of water. They will pray and then go home, and then there will be an opportunity for entertaining guests. Feeding the poor is particularly stressed during Ramadan. This was the practice of the Prophet. And there's often a very general public enthusiasm for doing this. I remember once I was in Cairo in Ramadan, and I visited the office of the NBC bureau chief, and it was getting towards the end of the day, and he said, "I know a really great place to have a meal, why don't you come with me?" And I thought, great, I get a free meal at the Meridian or somewhere. So I said, fine. And he took me in his car to the poorest, most run-down slum in Cairo. And we sat down on the street, on these sort of rush mats, and there was a public banquet being given for the poor of that district by the local mosque, which was done in that area every evening for everybody, and it was free of charge. And we had a great meal, open to everybody, and I certainly enjoyed myself more than I would have done at the Meridian. But that's a typical sight in Muslim cities in Ramadan. Also inviting the neighbours, inviting the poor amongst one's neighbours, etc. After eating, there is the no less important business of the night prayers, and these are followed by the most important religious ritual of the fasting month, the famous prayers of Taraweeh. These are not obligatory, but in practice a lot of people attend them. And ideally in each mosque the imam should recite the entire Quran throughout in the month, so you'll find a 30th part of the Quran being recited in the Taraweeh prayers every evening. The reason for this is that according to the Quran, the revelation was actually sent down from heaven during the month of Ramadan, so this is like a recollection of that. Taraweeh prayers, typically 20 rakahs. Devotional practices are also very much stressed. We are told that the nights in Ramadan are a time of particular holiness and spiritual potential. And there's something called the Night of Power, Laylat al-Qadr, referred to in Surah 97 of the Quran, which reads, "We have sent it," i.e. the Quran, "down on the night of power. What will convey to you what the night of power is? The night of power is better than 1,000 months. On that night the angels and the Spirit come down by their Lord's leave with every decree. Peace it is until the rising of the dawn." Now, a hadith refuses to specify exactly when the night of power might be, but tells us to seek it during the last odd-numbered nights of Ramadan. Very typically, people believe it to be the night of the 27th. This is a time of solitary, all-night vigils, Quranic recitation, meditation, and prayer. Spiritually minded people believe that the fath, the spiritual opening, is most likely to be granted at that time. Shortly afterwards, the month ends with one of the two great Muslim festivals. This is the Eid al-Fitr. Eid means a festival, and Eid al-Fitr is the one that happens the day after the last fasting day. And as with the other Muslim festival, which I'll talk about in a few minutes, this is canonically very simple. After saying the dawn prayer, people will go off to a large place, not necessarily just a local mosque, but traditionally it has to be the largest mosque of a city or even an open space. In English cities, we often use public paths, public parks. This will be, say, 7 or 8 o'clock in the morning. And theoretically, the entire community attends, men, women, and children. And there's a short sermon and a short prayer, and then people go back home, visit relations, take the day off. Presents are exchanged. Traditionally, people wear new clothes. Kids get new clothes on the Eid, and so forth. That brings Ramadan to a close, but one should be aware also that Muslims have other times of fasting. For instance, some pious people might follow the Prophet's example and fast every Monday and Thursday. Sometimes people fast the middle 3 days of each month. The day of Ashura, which is the Muslim extension of the Jewish Mosaic fast of Yom Kippur, is also observed in Islam. And there are several others. That's the fourth pillar. Moving on finally to the fifth. This is, of course, the Hajj, the Muslim pilgrimage. The Quran indicates that this is an obligation only for those who can afford it or manage it financially and physically. So if you're a poor peasant in Java or somewhere and you couldn't save up the money without seriously endangering your family, it's not one of the pillars of Islam for you. You're excused it, and there's no guilt attached to that. Otherwise, it's equally incumbent upon both sexes, has to be done at least once in one's life. Now, the Hajj is that dimension of Islam that most clearly binds Muslims to the Abrahamic origins of their faith. The Quran affirms that Abraham and Ishmael built the Kaaba as the world's first place of worship. And near Mecca, the pilgrims pass a place called Majra al-Kabsh, where it's believed that Abraham offered the sacrifice of his son in obedience to God's command. The actual rites of the Hajj are very complex, and they're actually very unfamiliar. They're not like anything else in Islam. Very briefly, they involve a sevenfold circumambulation, walking around the Kaaba, which represents disconnection from the 4 points of the compass and hence worldly attachments, and a focusing upon the presence of the divine, which is represented by the Kaaba. The pilgrims will also drink from the famous well of Zamzam, which I'll talk about in a subsequent lecture. They then progress rapidly 7 times between 2 tiny hills, which are called Safa and Marwa, which are sort of 300, 400 yards apart next to the great mosque in Mecca. They're connected nowadays by a huge walkway. And in the middle there's a channel for wheelchairs. These names mean respectively purity and humanity. And those who are interested in the symbolic significance of these rites will say that this sevenfold procession represents the polarity between the 2 aspects of man, the theomorphic and the animal. So you end up at the Mount of Safa. It also is an indication, and I'll talk about this a bit more later, of the Abrahamic origins of Islam, because it's said to commemorate Abraham's bondsmaid Hajar in her desperate search for water for her son. She went 7 times between these 2 hills. After that, the pilgrims go to the valley of Mina, about 3 or 4 miles outside Mecca, where there's a huge tent city that accommodates the 2 million or so people that do the Hajj every year. It is, of course, the world's largest temporary gathering of humanity, with the exception only of the great Melas of Hindu India. But it's different from them in as much as the Melas tend to be just Indian events, whereas the Hajj is conspicuously multinational. At Mina, they just pray and meditate until they move on to the culminating ritual of the Hajj, which is at a huge plain about 7 or 8 miles outside Mecca called Arafat. It's Arafat. Huge, very spectacular plain surrounded by bare mountains. And in the center of this, there's a hill known as the Jabal al-Rahmah, the Mount of Mercy. And tradition records that the Prophet preached his final sermon there, the so-called farewell sermon. Muslim tradition also believes that it was at Arafat that Adam and Eve were reconciled to God. The rite itself at Arafat is very straightforward. It's simply called the Waqf, or the standing. People stand before God and they pray. So you find this huge tent city filled with every conceivable ethnic group. Very spectacular event. All listening to and following prayers, typically in their own language. Various religious orders will hold ceremonies in their tents. And it's an authentic microcosm of the Muslim world. And the sense of equality is reinforced by the requirement on men not to wear their ordinary clothes, but to wear 2 seamless white garments, which recall the shrouds, which is all that we will wear when we are raised up to face the final judgment. And in fact, it's a common Muslim tradition to keep hold of these shrouds, these towels, which are called ihram, I-H-R-A-M, and you keep them for the rest of your life, and you're actually buried in them when you die. So this standing at Arafat goes on all day, and then when the sun sets, everybody simultaneously rushes back towards Mecca, because it has to happen simultaneously. It's a great logistic problem, and the Saudis have built 9 superhighways parallel to each other that take people and vehicles or walking, traditionally, of course, on camels and donkeys, from Arafat back to Mina. At Mina, the pilgrims submit to the ritual known as the stoning of the pillars. These are simply bare white pillars that represent the 3 places where the devil appeared to tempt Abraham. After this has been done, they have their heads shaved if they're men, or if they're women, they can just have their heads clipped, their hair clipped, and there's a final rite of circumambulation of the Kaaba, and essentially that's the obligations of the Hajj completed. Some people will travel on to the city of Medina, 280 miles to the north, to pay their respects to the Prophet, although that's not strictly speaking a component of the Hajj. So the Hajj is the 5th and in a sense the culminating rite of Islam. Hadith says that a Hajj faithfully and sincerely performed blots out all one's previous sins. It can be performed every year. Some people actually do that, but once is enough to discharge the obligation. Similarly, there is the lesser pilgrimage known as the Umrah, which is much shorter. Unlike the Hajj, which takes 3 or 4 days, the Umrah takes a couple of hours. Just entails the 7-fold circumambulation of the Kaaba and the procession between Safa and Marwa. That can be done at any time of the year, but the Hajj has to be done in the month of Dhul Hijjah, at the end of the Muslim year. Everybody does it simultaneously. So people go to Mecca and do this Umrah at all times of the year, and particularly in Ramadan and in another month called Rajab. The Haram, the sanctuary in Mecca, is really stuffed with people. So it's the culminating moment in the Muslim life. And it's the culminating rite almost in a cosmic sense. It's often remarked that the basic rites of Islam are linked to the natural world. So the 5 prayers a day follow the movements of the sun. The zakat and Ramadan are dictated by the movements of the moon, and Hajj, also dictated, of course, because it follows this calendar, by the movements of the moon, is a kind of symbolic return to the center, to the pivot, to the axis mundi, to the point where heaven and earth meet, where Adam and Eve were reconciled to God, and a line was hence drawn under original sin. And this reminds us that the whole Muslim life is permeated by this principle, which I'll speak of in more detail tomorrow, of dhikr, which means remembering, remembrance, remembering the reality from which we came. Every one of these pillars is designed to remind us. So there are 5 prayers a day, 1 congregational prayer a week, fasting month once a year, and 1 Hajj in a lifetime. These rites punctuate the entire Muslim life. And their purpose is clear. Islam believes that without constant dhikr, without being reminded, we will fall prey to our own selfish, self-centered tendencies and forget the divine reality. The human capacity for distraction and self-involvement is that strong. But as the hadith of Gabriel, with which I started, makes clear, all of these 5 pillars are no more than the pillars of Islam. They are the support, they are the first stage, they're indispensable. However, they are not the summation of the religion itself. The building itself is another matter, and that's what I'll be talking about tomorrow. I think you're well overdue for your coffee break. When we come back, I'll talk a little bit about some of the other collective aspects of the outward side of Islam, including Islamic law.